All right, so thank you very much. Before I jump into the presentation, I want to give a little context here. So I used to work for a large international NGO in Washington, D.C., and part of my job responsibilities was to do interviews after we had commissioned studies or reports. And it was during this interview with the BBC one time. It was with this guy, Richard Black. He really knows his environmental science very well. And he asked some really pointed questions that made me feel really uncomfortable during the interview. And I kind of fumbled through them. The topic was all about empirical models, and he was asking some questions about the limitations of those empirical models. And long story short, it really impressed upon me my desire to, do you want me to wear this?
Yeah.
Because you guys are recording. Well, that's kind of large. Okay, I'll try this. So I'm not going to be able to move around, but that's okay. How's that? Okay, so it impressed upon me the need to really improve empirical models. And, well, fast forward 10 years, here I am today. Okay, so that's the context. Now, I'm going to assume that probably half of you are familiar with different modeling approaches and half maybe not so much. So I'm just going to give really short background. Predictive modeling, a very common way of looking at or assessing the climate impacts on species distributions. Okay, predictive modeling can be generally broken up into two approaches: empirical, statistical approaches, and mechanistic or process-based, right? And the example that I give here for empirical approaches, I'm a dendro head by training, right? So I've done dendrochronology. So I had to use a time series of tree growth here. And I've correlated some tree growth, Doug fir in the North Cascades, with growing season precipitation. Okay, correlates pretty well. That's a type of empirical model. Okay, now they're great because they allow you to study really poorly understood or studied species across really large spatial extents. So relatively super easy to use, and they are used widely because of that. Mechanistic models, on the other, in contrast to that, can be very complex. And the example here is LPJ model, which is a dynamic global vegetation model, and it's simulating all these different processes that we know influence plants. Okay, so it uses temperature, precipitation, carbon dioxide concentrations, soils, even disturbances, and it simulates growth and mortality, biotic interactions. They can be really complex. And because of that, they are problematic to apply to individual species. Definitely difficult, computationally intensive to apply across wide or large spatial extents. So there are some limitations, but there are also strengths of both approaches. So we decided, this is the study extent for this part of my research, and we wanted to focus in on northwestern North America. Okay, we had to identify tree species that their ranges fit within the study area. And we only identified a handful, okay? So we've got Pacific silver fir, grand fir, noble fir, subalpine larch, western larch, Pacific yew, and western red cedar. Okay, so those are the species that I'm focusing in for this part of the study. And there's going to be a quiz at the end, so make sure you know your needles. The mechanistic model, I didn't actually run that. My colleague Sarah Schaefer with USGS ran that. So this is LPJ. And because it requires so much in-depth knowledge about the physiological processes of plants and stuff, they they generally produce these kind of coarse plant functional types, PFTs, right? And you can use other information, structural information in the environment to build then these coarse biomes. Okay, so this is the mechanistic model output that we're applying for this project. And you can see the examples I've given here. These are ones that are relevant to those tree species. These are biomes that LPJ produces. I should also note, because she's USGS employee, this is all publicly available data now. And she just produced a publication in PLOS One. Check it out. If you want the data, there are some links in that paper. So, okay, so general approach for this research was to integrate or combine empirical and mechanistic model outputs to refine species distributions. Essentially trying to come up with some more realistic projections of where species might be in the future. Okay. First, I had to build the empirical models, and these are relatively simple, just using historical climate, tree species range maps, and then building the statistical model. In this case, I used R package random forest, which is an ensemble classifier, so it builds all these classification trees, trying to predict whether a species is present, and then tallies the majority of those votes across it. Okay? And then for future projections, you just apply future climate. In this case, we used A2 scenario, because that's what Sarah used for her DGVM, that LPJ model, and across 5 different GCMs. Okay? So this is the range maps that we used. Coarse, very coarse. We decided to use these because, well, A, they're widely used by managers, and they are easy to get a hold of, and plot data, especially Forest Service FIA data, stops at the border. So we wanted to capture the climatic breadth, the full climatic breadth of these species, meaning we had to go into Canada as well. So we used these coarse range maps and built the model, applied that future climate data, projected into the future. Voila. I'm referring to these as unrefined because they haven't included the DGVM output yet. Okay, so I haven't integrated anything at this point yet. So the intensity of the colors on this map represent the GCM model agreement. So again, we had those 5 GCMs for general circulation models for the future. And if they all agreed, it got a really bright color. So for areas of expansion, it was bright blue, contraction, bright orange. And then if it were stable, then it just got the black color, okay? Stable meaning it was there historically, and the species model, distribution model projects that it's still going to be climatically suitable in the future. Stable, okay? So those are the unrefined projections. I'll be coming back to those. Then for the refined approach, this is where I integrate the DGVM output. I still use the species range maps, but before I built the species distribution model, I refined them using the DGVM biome maps, okay? So that's the refined species distribution right there. Then I built the species distribution model, okay? Applied future climate data, those 5 GCMs, projected the projections forward, and then again refined the output by the future 5 futures of those DGVMs. So it's a 2-step process of refining those. And at the end of all this, then I've got this refined future species distribution. Okay, so I'll run through that real quick. So species range map, yep, you saw that. Overlapping that or intersecting that with the relevant biomes from the DGVM, okay? So the pink area is the DGVM biomes. The black is Pacific silver firs distribution. Where they match up is this kind of dark red color here. Okay, so that's a refined species distribution. That's what I use to then build the statistical model, okay? And then apply that future climate data, and then refine it again with the future DGVMs, okay? So after all this is said and done, and I do that two-step refinement process, these are the refined future projections for Pacific silver fir. Considerably different from that other map that I showed you, right? So this is unrefined and refined. So I think I'll flip through this a couple times as I'm talking, but you get a sense for there's a lot less area that is projected to be stable for this species, okay? And a lot less suitable climate space in the future. So the refined distributions not only identify potential suitable climate for that species, but it also is projecting, thank you, areas that are going to be suitable because of the soils, because of these biotic interactions, because of increased carbon dioxide concentrations, and the influence of fire, okay? So I would argue that these are a lot more realistic projections. They're still model projections, okay? We still know that they're wrong, but I think that I am more confident that these areas are going to be more suitable in the future for this species. So, of the 7 species that we modeled, subalpine larch did not model very well and didn't really have any future projections for climate space, so we dropped that one. Of the remaining 6, 4 of them had this similar pattern. So we have Pacific silver fir, western larch, noble fir, and western red cedar. They had less future suitable climate space or environmental space. 2 species actually showed more. Okay, so grand fir and Pacific yew. It's kind of interesting just to kind of bring it back to a management perspective of why this might matter. Looking here, just out our back door, Coeur d'Alene National Forest, an area that is really productive for grand fir. These are the projections for grand fir. And the unrefined projections suggest that, you know, large areas, there's a lot of brown in there, right? So large areas are going to be relatively stable. If we look at the refined projections in the future, a lot of orange areas over there. So as a manager, I might think twice about what species I'm replanting after I harvest in some of these areas. So that's one type of, you know, potential implication of this type of work. Okay, so in conclusion, both models have strengths and weaknesses. Demonstrated one way that we can attempt to integrate that information and potentially come up with some more realistic projections, okay, and help identify the areas that some species are going to be more suitable climate space or environmental space in the future. All right, so acknowledgements, USGS, Nature Conservancy, Park Service, this large project that I was involved in, the Pacific Northwest Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment, and of course the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center. How am I doing on? I got 2 minutes for questions. All right, it's going to be rapid fire, right?
2 plus 5. So
2 plus 5. Oh, 7. All right, so not so rapid fire questions. Okay. So that's the work. If you have any questions, please email me. I think I have one of the world's shortest email addresses, which is amazing, awesome. Okay, yes, question over here.
yeah. Given the sort of broad latitudinal range of some of these species, your models account for the fact that species response may vary depending on whether you're talking about a northern or a southern, which edge of their climate range they're on, and
Yeah.
you deal with that in either the mechanistic or the correlative models or both.
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, I mean, really valid point in that species are going to respond probably different in the northern part of their range as compared to the southern part of their range. The unrefined models that are just species distribution models don't take that into account at all. We are assuming that the range, the climatic breadth just informs the model and pushes that forward into the future. However, the dynamic global vegetation models do incorporate some of those because they model they look at the biotic interactions between these plant functional types. So at the south, if it gets warmer and grand fir is not going to compete as well with Doug fir because it just doesn't do as well in those droughtier conditions, then the LPJ model or that DGVM is going to essentially simulate those interactions and show that this group of species is going to do better under a drier condition. So I think I have incorporated that, although it is implicit. Good question, though. Yes, second row.
About the future, how far along is that? Like how far away is
Oh, great question. I totally forgot. Sorry. So these projections are for the end of century, right? So averaged over, the 30 last years of the century. Yes, excellent question. Yes, Joe.
Do you think this type of modeling is applicable for urban areas?
No, I don't. I don't think, because the DGVM does not incorporate anthropogenic influences, so it's all potential biomes, I guess. So if we go back to that map, it would show the Columbia Plateau, for example. It's all grassland. It's not ag, which we know there's lots of ag there. So I don't think it would do very well for that. Could it be adapted to that? Yeah, potentially. We'd have to rewrite some of the algorithms within the DGVM, but I think that would be feasible. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Of course, I'm gonna let you go.
So, were you able to quantify or validate or quantify the uncertainty reduction that you may have done in the current distribution of any of those species based on maybe FIA data for just the U.S. portion? So you had your predictive model of distribution with your empirical, and you have these biome predictions from LPJ. When you combined them in that first step to get the distribution of the current range, were you able to validate that at all with actual observations?
Yeah.
Just to prove that the combination made it better?
Yep. No, that's the great question. Short answer is no. I haven't done that.
Yeah.
But that would be a logical next step to really show, are these models really doing better by this process of refining them, or are they missing a lot of of what we know is out there based on that plot data? So that would be a great next step. And if you want to help me with that, that'd be awesome. Yes, we have a question in the back.
These trees are common plants with lots of information. I'm curious about poorly known species, tribal food plants that might need to be moved. For instance, is this modeling approach applicable to poor databases, or do we have to create the information?
I think it would be applicable to poorly mapped species, but then that just predisposes whatever model you create to be more uncertain. So the model can only do as well as what the input data you have going into it, right? So if we wanted to do, validate this based on plot data, that would be the most ideal situation. But if we only have information as to, where plants are growing based on expert knowledge, then that's fine. The models will do the work. They're statistical models. If they correlate well, they'll correlate well. But the future projections, we just won't be as certain because that input data wasn't as robust, I guess. So it's feasible, but if you put uncertainty into the model, you're going to get more uncertainty on the other side of it. So, yes.
Which climate variables did you use for which species?
So the initial modeling of the species distribution model had 19 climate and bioclimatic variables, and we identified the most parsimonious models for each of the species. So we ended up using 1, 2, maybe 3 climate variables at the end of that modeling process to predict where that species would be before we did any of that refinement stuff. And so it varied by species. Pacific silver fir responded really well to precipitation. Particularly winter precipitation, because snow can limit the ability for that species to grow up in elevation. So, yeah, great question. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Is that it?
Yep, that's
We're
it.
done?
Yep.
Okay. So